Hello and happy Wednesday. I am Miriam Lacroix, attorney and founder at Lacroix Law PC, and today's wisdom is 5 tips for having a successful marriage-based green card application. So, as usual, typical disclaimer, do not take this video as a replacement for information that you can receive from an immigration attorney about your particular case. This is just general information that I've seen in my practice and working with a marriage-based green card application. So I just wanted to share some of my knowledge with you if you are going through that process. Today's Wednesday Wisdom is actually going to be recorded because apparently there is going to be a snowstorm here in New York, so I've decided to pre-record it, but feel free to leave your questions and comments, and I will be happy to answer those for you at the time that you ask them. So I'll be around when this posts on Facebook so that I can answer questions for you. So feel free to ask. Okay, so tip number 1. When you're submitting your packet to USCIS, make sure that you are submitting all of the evidence that they require for all the forms that you're submitting. I attend a lot of green card interviews, and some of the interviews I attend are with people who didn't hire me for their full immigration or green card case, right? And so they hire me at the time that the interview process has happened, and I ask to see their documentation and everything in order to prepare for the day of their interview, and I noticed that they are not submitting nearly as much as they need to submit for the adjudicator or the officer to review prior to their interview, right? So that makes the interview a lot longer. They're trying to get more information, then they have to review documentation that you bring the day of the interview. And I noticed that when I attend these interviews, the officers are always like, submit this documentation ahead of time so that I have time to review it, because maybe they could possibly make a decision on your case just by reviewing your application. Not that you won't get an interview, because you will get an interview, but they will likely have less questions to ask you if it's all down in the papers, right? They have all the information that they need, right? So make sure you're submitting all the evidence that is required for any type of form that you're submitting to USCIS. That is the most important thing to help you get your case adjudicated quicker than it would be if you were missing things. So that leads me to tip number 2. Make sure that all of the fields in the forms are completed fully, okay? Don't leave anything out. And if something doesn't apply to you, then be sure to write NA or not applicable, just so that the adjudicating officer is clear that you didn't just leave that blank, but that it doesn't actually apply to you. So a lot of times I see applications get slowed down because they're being rejected, right? They don't fill in the information that USCIS is looking for. And you have to be very, very careful of that, okay? So make sure that your forms are completed completely, filled in completely. And if there's something in that form that doesn't apply to you, then you can just write NA. Tip number 3. Please make sure that if you get what is called a request for evidence or an RFE, that you reply as soon as possible. So ideally, you would not get a request for evidence or an RFE because you submitted all the forms you needed to submit ahead of time, you've submitted all the evidence you needed to submit, everything is completely filled out and it's ready to go, right? But in the unfortunate circumstance that USCIS does not have what it needs to move forward, they will send you an RFE and they will be requesting more information in your case. If you get that, they give you a deadline, right? They give you a full 84 days because maybe there's some evidence that might take some time for you to actually obtain, right? But if it's something that you can get within the same week of receiving that RFE, then I recommend that you get that information into USCIS as soon as possible, way before the deadline, right? Don't wait till the end of the 84 days. One, because you're delaying your case, but two, you could accidentally miss the deadline, right? If you wait until the very last minute. So tip number 3 is to make sure that you are responding to your requests for evidence immediately, or as immediately as you can, to stop the delay of your case. All right, so tip number 4 is to tell your story. And I think that is overlooked often because you're filling out forms and you're submitting evidence, and it's just very like legal what you're doing when you're submitting a marriage-based green card application. But you have to understand that a USCIS officer is reading through your application and getting to know you, getting to understand why you got married or how you plan to build a life together, right? These are the things that get your case approved. And so tell your story with pictures, tell your story with text messages back and forth, with cards that you sent to each other, with social media posts, with gifts that you sent to each other or purchased for each other, with vacations that you took with each other, with the children that you had together. Tell this story of how you met and how you decided to get married, or why you decided to get married, and what your wedding was like and what marriage has been like, right? Make your application human. That really helps with the adjudicating officer when they are ready to approve your application, right? Because they see this story, they see a couple in love, and they see how you will build your life together going forward. And most importantly, they're able to determine that your marriage is for the purposes of building a life together and not the purposes of just obtaining immigration status. And that's exactly the thought that you're trying to combat when you submit your application. So don't be shy, tell your story, submit information about your relationship and your family and how your families came together, because that is all very helpful in your process. So last but not least, because I probably could talk for days about the marriage green card process, but my tip number 5 is to be prepared. Prepare yourself for your interview process, as well as you're preparing yourself for submitting your application to apply for your marriage green card, right? So you know that at the end of this, you're going to have an interview and you're going to have to speak with an officer about your case and why they should approve your case, right? So be prepared for that. Gather all the documents that you've already submitted, get some updated documents, right? If you submitted tax transcripts and bank statements, you want to get updated ones, because you're likely not going to have an interview for a year or a couple of years after you submit everything. So yes, make sure that you have updated documents, right? Make sure you know what type of questions that the officer is going to be asking you and how to prepare for that. Be completely prepared for the interview process, because I promise you, the more prepared you are, the easier, the smoother things go. So, as a recap, I gave you 5 tips for a successful winning green card application process. Tip number 1 was for you to make sure that you're submitting all the evidence that they require initially for every form that you're submitting, right? Tip number 2 related to that was to make sure that you're filling out every form completely. And if something doesn't apply to you, then you make that clear in your application. Tip number 3 was, if you got an RFE or a request for evidence, that you respond to it immediately so that you do not delay your case any further. Tip number 4 was to tell your story, right? Tell your story about how you and your spouse met and what you've been doing together, the time that you were dating, the time that you got married, what your wedding was like, and what you plan on doing in the future, right? Tell your relationship story. And finally, be prepared. Be prepared for your interview and anything else that comes before that during this process. Okay. So I hope that today's wisdom was helpful to you. If you are going through the marriage green card process, please don't do it alone. These tips are helpful, but an experienced immigration attorney really knows what to do when submitting an application like this. So be very careful if you're doing it yourself. If you have any questions, feel free to reach out. My number is 914-368-3550, and we look forward to hearing from you.